The cold metal handcuffs cut into my wrists like frozen razors, and Officer Martinez's grip on my arm was the only thing keeping me upright as my entire world crumbled around me. "Watch your head," he muttered, but I barely heard him over the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the grand floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwood mansion, my home for 15 years, I could see them standing there like actors taking their final bow after a flawless performance. Margaret Blackwood, the woman I'd called Mother since I was 7 years old, stood perfectly composed in her cream silk blouse, not a hair out of place, despite having just destroyed her adopted daughter's life. Beside her, Richard, Daddy Dearest, adjusted his gold cufflinks with the same casual indifference he showed when discussing stock portfolios over breakfast. And there, practically glowing with satisfaction, was Sarah fucking Coleman, the family friend who I now realised had been playing the starring role in this twisted family drama while I was nothing more than a prop. Sarah wasn't even trying to hide her smirk as the patrol car door slammed shut behind me. That's when every single puzzle piece clicked into place with such brutal clarity that I actually laughed. A sound so broken and bitter that Officer Martinez glanced at me in the rearview mirror with genuine concern. "You okay back there, miss?" "Okay?" I wanted to tell him that I just discovered my entire life was a lie, that the people who saved me from the orphanage had been grooming me for this exact moment, that I was about to serve 5 years in prison for embezzling money I'd never touched while their real daughter walked free. Instead, I just stared out the window and watched my childhood disappear behind us. Let me back up and tell you how perfectly they played me. 3 hours earlier, I was Halen Blackwood, honest student, dutiful daughter, the girl who thought she'd won the lottery when the wealthy Blackwoods chose her out of hundreds of orphans. I was sitting in my bedroom, working on my graduate thesis in business administration, completely oblivious to the fact that FBI agents were downstairs presenting my parents with a warrant for my arrest. The charges? Embezzling $2.3 million from Blackwood Enterprises over the past 2 years through a series of sophisticated financial transfers and forged documents. The evidence? My signature on bank authorizations I'd never seen, my employee ID used to access accounts I didn't even know existed, and security footage that somehow showed me entering the building at times when I was provably elsewhere. But here's the thing that should have been my first clue. When Agent Williams read me my rights, Margaret didn't cry. Richard didn't demand to see the evidence. They just stood there, Margaret wringing her hands in that practiced way she did when she wanted to appear distressed for the cameras, while Richard nodded gravely and said things like, "We're shocked," and "We'll cooperate fully with the investigation." The only person who seemed genuinely surprised was me. "There has to be some mistake," I kept saying as they searched my room, finding USB drives I'd never seen before hidden in my textbooks, discovering bank statements for accounts opened in my name that I knew nothing about. I would never steal from my own family. That's when Margaret finally looked at me directly, and for just a split second, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Not sadness, not shock, not even disappointment. Relief. "Oh, Halen," she said, and her voice carried just the right amount of maternal heartbreak for the agents. "We tried to give you everything. How could you do this to us?" But I caught it. The slight emphasis on you. Not how could you do this to us as a family, but how could you do this to us? Like there had always been an us and them, and I'd just been too naive to see which side I was on. The ride to the station gave me time to think, and that's when I started remembering things differently. Like how Sarah Coleman had been a fixture in our house since I was 8, supposedly the daughter of Richard's business partner who died in a car crash. How she had her own key, her own room that was somehow always better decorated than mine, her own set of parents who treated her like she was their blood while treating me like their charity project. I remembered family dinners where Sarah sat at Richard's right hand while I sat across from them, how she called them Margaret and Richard, but they called her sweetheart and princess, while I got Halen and occasionally dear. I remembered family vacations where Sarah got the better hotel room, family photos where I was somehow always positioned on the edge like an afterthought, family meetings about the business that Sarah attended while I was sent to my room. But the memory that really broke me was from last Christmas. I'd walked into Richard's study to ask about graduate school funding and found him, Margaret, and Sarah huddled over some documents. The moment they saw me, Margaret swept the papers into a drawer while Richard's face went through this quick transformation from warm affection to polite recognition. "What did you need, Halen?" he asked, and I remembered thinking it was weird how formal he sounded. "Just wondering about the tuition payment for next semester," I said. "We'll discuss it later," Margaret interrupted, but Sarah was already pulling out her phone to show them something, and I was forgotten. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, waiting for them to remember I existed, before quietly backing out of the room. I heard Sarah laugh as I closed the door, and Margaret said something like, "She has no idea, does she?" At the time, I thought they were planning some kind of surprise for me. Now I realized they were planning my destruction. The FBI had been building their case for months, they told me during the interrogation. They had evidence dating back 2 years, showing systematic embezzlement from Blackwood Enterprises. All of it traced back to me. My fingerprints were on documents, my access card was used to enter secure areas, my bank account showed deposits that matched the stolen amounts. "The thing is, Miss Blackwood," Agent Williams said, sliding a photograph across the metal table, "we have security footage of you making these transfers." I stared at the grainy black and white image. It was definitely me, my face, my hair, my clothes. I was sitting at a computer terminal in the Blackwood Enterprises financial department, typing something on the keyboard with a focused expression. "I've never been in that room," I said. "I don't even have access to the financial systems." "According to our records, you've had access for 2 years," Agent Rodriguez chimed in, "authorized by Richard Blackwood himself." They showed me the authorization form with Richard's signature and my employee profile, complete with a security clearance I didn't know I had. Everything looked legitimate except for one small detail. I'd never signed up for any of it. "I want to call my father," I said. "You can call a lawyer," Williams replied. "Your father is the one who reported the theft." That's when it hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Richard had reported me. My own father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who walked me through my first business presentation, who told me I was the smartest person he knew, had called the FBI and told them his daughter was a thief. The arraignment was a joke. My court-appointed lawyer was clearly overworked and underprepared, while the prosecutor laid out a case so airtight it could have been choreographed, which I was starting to realize it probably was. They had everything. Financial records, security footage, witness testimony from Blackwood Enterprises employees who swore they'd seen me acting suspiciously. Even my own access logs showed me entering the building at odd hours, though I could have sworn I was at home studying. "Your Honour," the prosecutor said, "the defendant has shown a pattern of sophisticated financial manipulation that suggests premeditation and calculation. She used her position as the CEO's daughter to gain access to sensitive systems and systematically stole over $2 million from the family business. We believe she represents a significant flight risk given her access to family resources." Flight risk? I didn't even have my own credit card. Everything I owned came from the Blackwoods, and they just cut me off completely. I had maybe $200 in my checking account and a bus pass. But the judge saw it differently. "Bail is set at $500,000. I looked back at the gallery, hoping to see Margaret and Richard there to support me, maybe looking stricken but determined to help their daughter through this nightmare. Instead, I saw them sitting with Sarah, the three of them looking like a complete family unit while I sat alone at the defendant's table like an outsider. Margaret caught my eye and gave me this sad little wave, the kind you give someone you feel sorry for but don't really know. Richard wouldn't even look at me. And Sarah. Sarah was checking her phone like she had somewhere better to be. That's when I understood the real scope of their betrayal. This wasn't just about money or even about getting rid of me. This was about replacing me completely. They'd probably been planning this for years, carefully documenting everything I did, building a case against me while training Sarah to take my place in the family business. I thought about all the times Sarah had asked me about my classes, my internships, my plans for the future. I thought she was being friendly, maybe a little sister figure looking up to me. Now I realised she was studying me, learning everything she needed to know to step into my life once I was gone. The county jail was exactly as horrible as you'd expect. But the worst part wasn't the food or the smell or the constant noise. It was the phone call I made to the Blackwood house that first night. Margaret answered on the third ring. "Blackwood residence." "Mom, it's me," I said, and I hated how desperate I sounded. There was a long pause. "Halen, how are you doing, dear?" Dear, not sweetheart, not honey, not even my name said with warmth. Just dear, like I was a distant relative she felt obligated to be polite to. "I need help," I said. "I need a real lawyer, Mum. I didn't do this." Another pause. "The court appointed you a lawyer." "A public defender who's never handled a white-collar case. Mum, you know me. You know I would never steal from Dad's company." "I thought I knew you," she said quietly. "But the evidence is very clear, Halen. Very clear." "What evidence? I've never even been in that department." "The FBI showed us the security footage. We saw you, Halen. We saw you stealing from us." I could hear voices in the background, Richard saying something I couldn't make out, and Sarah laughing at something on TV. It sounded so normal, so comfortable, like they were having a pleasant family evening while I sat in jail accused of crimes I didn't commit. "Please," I whispered, "I'm your daughter." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, colder. "No, Halen, you're not..." The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone until the automated system told me my time was up. That's when I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face for 15 years. I was never their daughter, I was their patsy. Sarah was their real daughter, probably hidden away to protect her from something. Maybe Richard's business dealings, maybe family enemies, maybe just the scrutiny that comes with being part of a wealthy family. They needed a face for the public, a daughter they could parade around at charity events and country club dinners, someone to take the heat if their carefully constructed world ever came crashing down. And they'd chosen me, a 7-year-old orphan who was so grateful for a family that I never questioned why I didn't quite fit, why I always felt like I was performing rather than just being, why I had to earn my place at their table every single day while Sarah simply existed in their orbit like she belonged there. They'd raised me, educated me, given me just enough access to the business to make me a credible suspect. And then they'd throw me away the moment I was no longer useful. Worse than that, they'd made me useful by making me their scapegoat. The trial was scheduled for 6 months away, which meant 6 months in county jail. Since I couldn't make bail. 6 months to sit in a concrete cell and think about how perfectly they'd played me. 6 months to realise that every kindness they'd shown in me had been an investment in this moment. Every opportunity they'd given me had been designed to build the case against me. But sitting in that cell, staring at the graffiti on the walls, and listening to my cellmate snore, I started to feel something I'd never felt before. Not sadness, not betrayal, not even anger. I felt clarity. They thought they were so clever, getting rid of their inconvenient adopted daughter while protecting their precious real child. They thought I'd disappear quietly, serve my time, and crawl away, broken and defeated. They'd underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible. They'd given me their world, their education, their connections, their understanding of how power really works. They taught me to think strategically, to plan for the long term, to never show weakness to your enemies. They just never considered that one day they might be my enemies. As I lay on that thin mattress that first night, planning my defense and thinking about my future, I smiled for the first time since the handcuffs clicked shut. Because Margaret was wrong about one thing. I am their daughter. They made me exactly like them, calculating, patient, and absolutely ruthless when it comes to protecting what's mine. They were about to learn just how well they taught me. The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Judge Harrison's voice echoed through the courtroom. 5 years in state prison. 5 years. The number hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't give them the satisfaction. Behind me, I heard Margaret let out a theatrical gasp, probably for the benefit of the reporters she'd tipped off about the tragic fall of the Blackwood heir. I turned around one last time before they led me away, and there they were. My perfect fake family, sitting in the front row, like mourners at a funeral they'd orchestrated themselves. Richard was already on his phone, probably calling his PR team to spin this disaster into sympathy for the devastated parents who tried so hard to save their troubled adopted daughter. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that I noticed was bone dry. And Sarah? Sarah was taking notes in a little leather journal, probably documenting my sentencing for whatever story they'd tell at their next charity gala. "Any last words for your family?" a reporter shouted as the bailiff cuffed me. I looked directly at Sarah and smiled. "I'll see you soon." The confusion on her face was worth everything. Riverside Correctional Facility for Women was a concrete fortress that looked like it was designed to crush hope before you even walked through the doors. The intake process was deliberately humiliating. Strip searches, delousing powder, rough hands shoving you into orange jumpsuits that smelled like industrial detergent and despair. My cellmate was a woman named Officer Martinez, who'd been serving 3 years for insurance fraud. She was smart, street smart, in ways I'd never had to be, and she looked at me with the kind of calculated assessment I was starting to recognise in myself. "Let me guess," she said on my first night, watching me try to figure out how to sleep on a mattress that was basically a yoga mat with delusions of grandeur. "Rich girl, first offence, probably embezzlement or tax evasion?" "Embezzlement," I confirmed. She laughed, but not unkindly. "Yeah, you got that. I've never been punched in the face look. How much did you steal?" 2.3 million, allegedly." Her eyebrow shot up. "Allegedly? So you're innocent?" "I'm guilty of being stupid enough to trust the wrong people." Rosa studied me for a long moment. "You know what your problem is, Princess? You're still thinking like a victim. In here, victims don't survive. Predators do." That conversation changed everything. The first 6 months were hell. I won't lie to you about that. Prison has its own ecosystem, its own rules, and its own food chain. I was prey, educated, soft, with no street credibility, and a target on my back because everyone assumed I was some spoiled rich girl who'd gotten caught with her hand in the cookie jar. I learned to sleep with one eye open. I learned to eat quickly and never leave food on my tray because showing waste was showing weakness. I learned that respect in prison isn't given, it's earned, and the currency for earning it isn't kindness or intelligence, it's usefulness. My breakthrough came in month 7, during a conversation with Diane Fletcher, a woman serving 15 years for running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had bilked investors out of $40 million. Diane was prison royalty. She had her own cell, her own crew, and enough commissary money to live better than most people on the outside. "You're wasting your potential," she told me one day in the library, where I'd been spending most of my free time. "You've got education, you understand finance, and you're sitting here reading romance novels like some suburban housewife. What else am I supposed to do?" She slid a copy of Forbes across the table. "You're supposed to get dangerous." That's when my real education began. Diane became my mentor in ways the Blackwoods never had been. She taught me that everything I'd learned about business was just the polite, legal surface of something much deeper and more brutal. She showed me how shell companies worked, how to move money through international accounts, how to manipulate stock prices, how to destroy someone's credit rating from the inside. The rich stay rich because they understand that money isn't just currency, she explained during one of our evening study sessions. It's power, it's influence, it's the ability to rewrite reality to suit your needs. Your fake parents understood that. They used their money to buy themselves a perfect little scapegoat and a clean reputation. The question is, what are you going to do with what they taught you? I started small. I convinced Rosa to let me help her write letters to her lawyer, using my business writing skills to craft appeals that actually got attention. Word spread, and soon I was writing letters, reviewing contracts, and helping other inmates navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of the appeals process. But my real breakthrough came when I helped a woman named Carmen Santos expose the guard who'd been sexually assaulting inmates in exchange for privileges. Carmen had documentation, but she didn't know how to present it in a way that would be taken seriously. I helped her organize the evidence, write a compelling complaint, and navigate the reporting process. 2 weeks later, the guard was arrested, and Carmen's sentence was reduced by 2 years for her cooperation with the investigation. Suddenly, I wasn't just the rich girl who got caught stealing. I was the rich girl who could get things done. That's when the real opportunities started opening up. I started corresponding with other inmates' lawyers, offering my business expertise in exchange for legal advice about my own case. I learned about appeals processes, evidence standards, and the kind of technical errors that could overturn convictions. More importantly, I learned about the legal vulnerabilities of the people who'd put me here. One of the most crucial relationships I developed was with Janet Kim, a former securities lawyer serving time for insider trading. Janet had been disbarred, but she still knew the financial world better than anyone I'd ever met. She looked at my case files with professional interest and pointed out something that had been bothering me, but that I hadn't been able to articulate. "This is too clean," she said, spreading the documents across her bunk. "The evidence against you is too perfect. Real embezzlement is messy. There are digital footprints, transaction irregularities, timing issues. This looks like someone had access to both the money and your personal information, plus the technical knowledge to create a completely artificial paper trail." "So you believe I didn't do it?" Janet shrugged. "I believe someone very smart framed you very carefully. The question is whether you're smart enough to frame them back." That conversation led to the most important decision of my incarceration. I stopped trying to prove my innocence and started planning my revenge. I began keeping detailed records of everything I learned about the Blackwood family's business dealings. I subscribed to industry publications, tracked their stock prices, monitored their public appearances. I used my visiting privileges not for emotional support but for intelligence gathering, convincing former classmates and business contacts to tell me about Richard's recent investments, Margaret's charity work, and Sarah's increasing visibility in the company. What I discovered was fascinating. After my arrest, Sarah had quickly stepped into the role I was supposed to fill. She'd been hired as a junior executive at Blackwood Enterprises, despite having no business education or relevant experience. She was appearing at charity events as the grieving sister of their adopted daughter who'd betrayed their trust. She was even living in my old room, according to a society page photo I'd seen. But the most interesting detail came from my former roommate at college, who'd kept in touch with some of our business school classmates. During a visit, she mentioned almost casually that Sarah had been asking a lot of questions about me before my arrest. Not emotional questions about how I was doing, but specific questions about my class schedules, my internship responsibilities, and my access to family business information. She said she was worried about you, my friend told me. Said you'd been acting strange and she wanted to help. We thought it was sweet how much she cared. Sweet? Sure. I started mapping out Sarah's movements in the months before my arrest, cross-referencing them with the timeline of the alleged embezzlement. What I found was a pattern so clear it was almost insulting. Every major theft in the prosecution's timeline corresponded with a day when Sarah had been at the house or at Blackwood Enterprises, often when I was provably elsewhere. More importantly, I started understanding the real scope of what they'd done to me. This wasn't just about getting rid of an inconvenient adopted daughter. This was about inheritance, about control of Blackwood Enterprises, about ensuring that Sarah inherited everything without having to share it with someone who had legal claim to the family name. By making me a convicted felon, they'd eliminated any possibility that I could contest Richard's will or claim any part of the business empire I'd helped build. Sarah wouldn't just be replacing me, she'd be erasing me completely. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that prison would break me, that I'd serve my time quietly and disappear into obscurity, grateful just to be free. They never considered that prison might make me stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. During my 3rd year inside, I received a letter that changed everything. It was from a private investigator named David Chen who specialised in financial crimes. He'd been following my case as part of research he was doing on corporate family fraud, and he'd noticed some irregularities in the evidence that had convicted me. "I believe you were framed," his letter said, "and I think I can prove it. But I need your cooperation and your insight into the family dynamics that made this possible." I wrote back immediately. David's investigation uncovered what my overworked public defender had missed. Digital forensics evidence that showed my employee access cards had been cloned, security footage that had been selectively edited, and financial records that showed a pattern of account access that was inconsistent with my known schedule and location. More damaging to the Blackwoods was what he discovered about Sarah's real identity. She wasn't just Richard's hidden daughter. She was his daughter from an affair he'd had 20 years ago, an affair that had produced a child he'd kept secret from Margaret and the public for 2 decades. Sarah's mother had been blackmailing Richard for years, and when she died in what was officially ruled an accidental overdose, Sarah had stepped into her mother's role. But here's the beautiful part. David found evidence that Richard had been embezzling money from his own company for years to pay for Sarah's upbringing, her education, and her mother's silence. The $2.3 million I was accused of stealing? It was just the tip of the iceberg. Richard had stolen over $15 million from Blackwood Enterprises over the past decade, and when the SEC started sniffing around, he needed a scapegoat. Enter the devoted adopted daughter who trusted him completely and never questioned why she suddenly had access to financial systems she'd never requested. I was released after serving 4 years and 3 months, early release for good behaviour and my work helping other inmates with their legal cases. But I wasn't the same person who'd been led away in handcuffs. I was harder, smarter, and absolutely committed to destroying the people who'd destroyed me. The day I walked out of Riverside Correctional, David Chen was waiting for me with a folder full of evidence and a proposal that made me smile for the first time in years. "Are you ready to take your life back?" he asked. I looked back at the prison walls that had been my home, my school, and my forge for over 4 years. I'm ready to take everything back, with interest. Because here's what the Blackwoods never understood. They didn't just betray me when they sent me to prison. They educated me. They showed me exactly how ruthless you have to be to survive in their world, and then they gave me 4 years to perfect those skills. Now it was time for their final lesson, and I was going to be a very thorough teacher. The first thing I did when I walked out of prison was buy a phone. The second thing I did was call the Blackwood house. Margaret answered, and I could practically hear her heart stop when I said, "Hello, Mum. I'm out." The silence stretched for exactly 12 seconds. I counted, before she managed to stammer, "Helen, but your sentence wasn't supposed to end for another 9 months." "Good behaviour," I said sweetly. "You raised me so well." I could hear her breathing, sharp and panicked, and I smiled. 4 years and 3 months of planning, and it was all starting with this perfect moment of terror in her voice. "Where are you staying?" she asked, trying to sound maternal but failing spectacularly. "Don't worry about me, Margaret. I'm very good at taking care of myself now. You taught me that too." I hung up and immediately called David Chen. Phase 1 is complete. They know I'm out and they're scared. How long before they start making mistakes? Based on the psychological profile we discussed, I'd say Margaret will panic within hours and Richard will try to control the situation. Sarah? David paused. Sarah's the wild card. She's been living your life for 4 years. She's not going to give it up easily. He was right. Within 6 hours of my release, I had 3 missed calls from Richard, 2 voicemails from Margaret begging me to come home so we can talk, and a text from Sarah that simply said, "We need to meet." I ignored them all. I had work to do. The apartment I'd rented was in downtown Chicago, 12 miles from the Blackwood mansion, but a world away from the life I'd once known. It was small, sparse, and perfect for what I needed. Complete privacy and high-speed internet. David had helped me set up multiple bank accounts under shell companies I'd created using techniques Diane had taught me. Legally obtained seed money from a settlement David had negotiated for my wrongful conviction gave me enough capital to start phase 2. But first, I needed to see what I was working with. 4 years changes everything. The Blackwood enterprises I returned to existed mostly in newspapers and financial reports, but what I read made my blood sing with possibility. Richard had been busy during my incarceration, expanding aggressively into real estate development and international shipping. Sarah had been appointed as Vice President of Strategic Development, a position that hadn't existed when I left, created specifically for her and carrying a salary that would have made my old self sick with envy. More interesting was what the financial reports didn't say. Reading between the lines with my prison-educated eye for fraud, I could see the telltale signs of a company hemorrhaging money while maintaining the appearance of growth. Over-leveraged real estate deals, shipping contracts that seemed too good to be true, and accounting practices that pushed the boundaries of legal. They were in trouble, deep trouble, and they didn't even know it yet. My first target wasn't Richard or Margaret, or even Sarah. It was Jonathan Mills, Richard's business partner, and the man who'd signed off on several of the questionable contracts I'd identified. Jonathan had always been the weak link in Richard's network, ambitious but sloppy, greedy but not particularly bright. I'd kept in touch with Jonathan's secretary during my incarceration through carefully crafted Christmas cards and thank you notes. She thought I was sweet, the poor wrongfully accused girl who'd been so polite to her during family business meetings. She had no idea she'd been feeding me intelligence for years. "Mr. Mills is having some personal difficulties," she'd written in her last letter. "Divorce proceedings have been quite stressful, and he's been working very long hours trying to manage the offshore shipping accounts." Offshore shipping accounts. Bingo. I arranged to accidentally encountered Jonathan at his favourite bar, a high-end whiskey lounge where he went to drink away his marital problems. He looked older, softer around the edges, with the kind of desperate exhaustion that comes from trying to juggle too many lies at once. "Hey, Lynn." He did a double take when he saw me approach his table. "Jesus, I heard you were... when did you get out?" "Last week," I said, sliding into the seat across from him without being invited. "You look good, Jonathan. Divorce treating you well?" He laughed bitterly. "About as well as prison treated you, I imagine." "Oh, prison was very educational. I learned so much about financial crime and how to spot it." I signalled the waitress for a drink. "For instance, I learned that shell companies in the Cayman Islands require very specific documentation to be legitimate. Documentation that has to be filed within 60 days of the initial transaction, or the accounts become legally vulnerable to seizure." The colour drained from Jonathan's face so quickly I thought he might faint. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. "The Meridian shipping contracts," I said conversationally. $3.7 million in the first quarter alone, all routed through Caribbean Development Holdings, which, according to my research, doesn't actually exist as anything more than a post office box in Georgetown. Jonathan's hand shook as he reached for his drink. "Even if that were true, which it's not, it has nothing to do with you. Doesn't it? Because I'm pretty sure Richard used my employee credentials to authorize those transfers. Just like he did with the money I supposedly embezzled." I leaned forward. "The difference is, this time I have a very expensive lawyer and a private investigator who specializes in international financial fraud." "What do you want?" "I want you to tell me everything. Every illegal deal, every forged document, every time Richard used my name or credentials for something I never authorized. In exchange, I'll make sure your name stays out of the federal investigation that's about to destroy Blackwood Enterprises." Jonathan lasted exactly 47 minutes before he broke. By the end of our conversation, I had recordings of him confessing to financial fraud spanning 6 years, implicating Richard in everything from tax evasion to money laundering. But the most beautiful revelation was about Sarah. "She's been handling the European accounts for the past 2 years, Jonathan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richard set up the access using your old credentials, but Sarah's the one making the transfers. She thinks she's being clever, but she's leaving digital fingerprints everywhere. Sarah wasn't just living my life. She was committing crimes in my name." The irony was so perfect, I almost laughed out loud. Phase 2 began the next morning. I used Jonathan's information to trace the European accounts, and what I found was even better than I'd hoped. Sarah had been embezzling money not just from Blackwood Enterprises, but from the charitable foundation Margaret ran. Hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for children's hospitals and homeless shelters had been diverted to accounts Sarah controlled. But she'd been sloppy about it. Prison had taught me to be methodical, to cover my tracks, to think 3 steps ahead. Sarah had the arrogance of someone who'd never faced consequences for her actions. She'd left a trail of evidence that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. I spent 2 weeks building an airtight case against her, complete with financial records, transaction logs, and digital forensics that David's team had compiled. Then, I did something Sarah would never have expected. I sent it all to Margaret. The package arrived at the Blackwood house on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier with a note that simply said, "Thought you should know what your real daughter has been up to. H." The explosion was immediate and spectacular. Margaret called me within an hour, hysterical. "How dare you? How dare you spy on our family and make these horrible accusations?" "Which accusations, Margaret? The ones about Sarah stealing from your charity, or the ones about Richard using my identity to commit fraud for the past 6 years? You're lying. You're just trying to hurt us because you're bitter about going to prison." I'm sure that's what you told yourself when you watched them arrest me for crimes Sarah committed. How does it feel, knowing your precious, real daughter is exactly what you pretended I was? Margaret's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. You were nothing when we found you. A pathetic little orphan who should have been grateful for everything we gave you. And this is how you repay us? This is how I collect what you owe me, I said, with interest. The next call came from Richard, and his approach was entirely different. No tears, no accusations, just cold calculation. What do you want? He asked. I want what was always mine. I want my name cleared. I want compensation for the 5 years you stole from me. And I want Sarah to face the same justice system that railroaded me. That's not going to happen. Then you're going to lose everything. Your company, your reputation, your freedom. Because unlike you, I actually have evidence of the crimes I'm alleging. There was a long pause. How much? I'm sorry. How much money do you want to make this go away? I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money, Richard. This is about justice. This is about watching your perfect little world burn down around your ears, while you realise that everything you did to me is about to happen to the people you actually care about. Helen, be reasonable. I was reasonable for 15 years. I was grateful, I was obedient, I was everything you wanted me to be, and you threw me away like garbage to protect your real family. Now, I'm going to show you what unreasonable looks like. The federal investigation launched exactly 1 week later. David had spent months building relationships with SEC investigators and FBI financial crime specialists, feeding them information about Blackwood Enterprises' questionable practices. When the evidence against Sarah landed on their desks, thoroughly documented, legally obtained, and absolutely damning, they moved fast. The morning of the raids, I was sitting in Tia's coffee shop across from Blackwood Enterprises, watching through the window as FBI agents carried boxes of evidence out of the building. Employees stood on the sidewalk looking confused and scared, and I felt a deep satisfaction watching the chaos unfold. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. This is all your fault. I typed back, no, this is all your fault. I'm just making sure you get credit for it. But the real masterpiece wasn't the federal investigation. That was just the opening act. While Richard and Margaret scrambled to deal with criminal charges and media attention, I was quietly buying up Blackwood Enterprises' debt. Remember those over-leveraged real estate deals I'd identified? Those shipping contracts that seemed too good to be true. All of those ventures were financed through loans that were now in default thanks to the federal asset freeze. Banks were panicking, investors were fleeing, and creditors were demanding immediate payment. Using the shell companies I'd created and the financial techniques Diane had taught me, I purchased that debt for pennies on the dollar. Legally, quietly, and with the kind of patience that 4 years in prison had beaten into me. Within 60 days of the FBI raids, I owned 47% of Blackwood Enterprises' total debt, which meant I owned 47% of everything Richard had built. The phone call I'd been waiting for came on a cold Thursday morning in November. You won, Richard said without preamble. What do you want? I want a meeting. All of you, tomorrow night at the house. We're going to discuss the terms of your surrender. Our surrender? Richard, I own your company's debt. I have evidence of your crimes, and your precious daughter is about to be indicted for embezzlement and fraud. You don't have a position to negotiate from anymore. You have exactly what I had 4 years ago, nothing. The silence stretched between us, and I could practically hear him calculating his options and coming up empty. Fine, he said finally. Tomorrow night. Oh, and Richard, make sure Sarah's there. I have something special planned for her. As I hung up the phone, I looked at myself in the mirror of my small apartment. The woman staring back at me was nothing like the naive girl who'd been led away in handcuffs 4 years ago. This woman was harder, smarter, and absolutely ruthless in pursuit of what she wanted. Tomorrow night, I was going home. Not as their adopted daughter, not as their victim, but as their conqueror, and I was going to enjoy every second of their destruction. I stood at the gates of the Blackwood mansion for the first time in over 4 years, and it felt like looking at a museum exhibit of my former life. The iron gates that had once meant safety and belonging now looked like prison bars, fitting, considering what this place had really been for me all along. The security guard who buzzed me in was new, probably hired after the FBI raids made Richard paranoid about who he could trust. He looked nervous when he saw my name on his list, like he'd been briefed on exactly who I was and what I represented. Margaret opened the front door before I could ring the bell. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 4 years. Her perfectly styled hair was now streaked with grey she wasn't bothering to hide, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. "Helen," she said, and for just a moment, I heard something almost like relief in her voice, as if part of her had missed me despite everything. "Margaret," I replied, not giving her the satisfaction of calling her mum. That privilege had been revoked the night she told me I wasn't really her daughter. She led me to the living room where Richard and Sarah were waiting. Richard looked every bit the cornered businessman. His suit was immaculate, but his tie was slightly crooked, a detail the old Richard would never have missed. Sarah, on the other hand, looked defiant. She was sitting in what used to be my favourite chair, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she was staring at me like I was an unwelcome intruder in her home. "Wow," I said, settling into the chair across from them. "Isn't this cosy? Just like old times. Except now you're all facing federal charges and I'm the one holding your futures in my hands." "You think you're so clever," Sarah spat, "but you have no idea what you've really done. You've destroyed innocent people's lives just to get revenge for your own failures." I laughed, and the sound echoed off the high ceilings of the room where I'd once felt so small and grateful. "Innocent? Sarah, you embezzled money from children's hospitals. You used my identity to commit fraud for years. The only innocent person in this room is me, and we all know how that turned out." "Enough," Richard interrupted. "Let's get to the point. What are your terms?" I pulled out a folder from my briefcase, the same kind of expensive leather briefcase Richard had given me for my 18th birthday, back when he was still pretending I mattered to him. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, spreading documents across the coffee table. "First, you're going to publicly admit that I was innocent of the embezzlement charges. Full-page ad in the Chicago Tribune, press conference, the works. My name gets cleared completely." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "That would be admitting we were wrong. It would raise questions about how the evidence against you was obtained." "Good. I want those questions raised. I want people to wonder how a loving family could send their innocent daughter to prison. I want them to realize exactly what kind of people you really are." "What else?" Richard asked, his voice flat. "Second, I want $50 million in compensation for the 5 years you stole from me, the career you destroyed, and the psychological damage from discovering my entire childhood was a lie." Sarah shot to her feet. $50 million? Are you insane? The company doesn't have that kind of liquid capital, especially not with the asset freeze. "Which brings me to point 3, I continued calmly. "I'm calling in all the debt I purchased. Blackwood Enterprises has 72 hours to pay me $230 million, or I take possession of every asset the company owns." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face had gone completely white, and Margaret was gripping the arm of her chair so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. "You can't do this," Richard whispered. "That company has been in my family for 3 generations. And now it's going to be in mine. The difference is, I'll have actually earned it." "There has to be another way," Margaret pleaded. some compromise we can reach. You were part of this family for 15 years, Halen. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I looked at her for a long moment, remembering the woman who had tucked me in at night, who had taught me to drive, who had been the closest thing to a real mother I'd ever known. Then I remembered her voice on the phone that first night in jail. No, Halen, you're not my daughter. It meant everything to me, I said quietly, right up until the moment you threw me away to protect her. Sarah was pacing now, her composure finally cracking. This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz back in here after 4 years and demand our entire lives as payment for your wounded feelings. Watch me. That's when Richard played what he thought was his trump card. You know what, Halen? You're right. We did frame you. We used your credentials, we planted evidence, we destroyed your life to protect our real daughter. But here's what you don't know. We weren't protecting Sarah from the law. We were protecting her from something much worse. I felt the first flutter of unease, but I kept my voice steady. What are you talking about? Richard looked at Margaret, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Tell her, Margaret whispered. Sarah isn't just my daughter from an affair, Richard said. She's my daughter with Eleanor Kozlov. The name hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor Kozlov, the daughter of Dmitry Kozlov, one of the most dangerous crime bosses in Eastern Europe. I'd read about the Kozlov family during my research into international money laundering. They weren't just criminals, they were killers. Elena died in what the police called an accidental overdose, Richard continued. But we know better. Dmitry found out about Sarah's existence, and he wanted her back. Eleanor refused to give up her daughter, so he had her killed. Sarah has been living under our protection ever since, hidden from a grandfather who would either kill her or turn her into a monster. My mind was racing. If this was true, if Sarah really was connected to the Kozlov crime family, then everything I'd done, the federal investigation, the media attention, the public exposure of the family's finances, had just painted a target on all of their backs. You're lying, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young woman who looked exactly like Sarah, standing next to a man I recognized from FBI wanted posters. Dmitry Kozlov himself. That's Eleanor at 17, Margaret said, right before she ran away from her father and came to America, right before she met Richard and got pregnant with Sarah. I stared at the photograph, my carefully constructed revenge plan suddenly feeling like it was built on quicksand. Even if this is true, it doesn't excuse what you did to me. You still destroyed an innocent person's life. To save another innocent person's life, Richard shot back. When the SEC started investigating our finances, we knew it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the payments we'd been making to keep Sarah hidden. We needed a scapegoat, someone whose conviction would satisfy the investigators and keep them from digging deeper. We chose you because we thought you were strong enough to survive it. Strong enough to survive 5 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit. Strong enough to come back and make us pay for it, Margaret said softly, which you have. Sarah was staring at me now with something that might have been respect. You really did it, didn't you? You actually managed to destroy everything we built. Not everything, I said, but even as I spoke, I was realizing the horrible irony of my situation. I'd spent 4 years planning revenge against people who had betrayed me, only to discover that my revenge might have signed all of our death warrants. There's something else you need to know, Richard said. The federal investigation you triggered? It's already drawn attention from people we've spent years trying to avoid. David Chen, your private investigator, he's been asking questions about the Kozlov connection, questions that are going to get back to Dmitry eventually. My blood ran cold. David had been so focused on clearing my name and exposing the Blackwoods crimes that he'd never considered the possibility that some secrets were buried for good reason. "How long do we have?" I asked. Based on our security consultant's assessment, maybe 2 weeks before Dimitri's people track Sarah down. The media attention from your press conference made it impossible to keep her location secret. I looked around the room at these people who had raised me, betrayed me, and now found themselves trapped in a nightmare partly of my making. The old Halen would have felt guilty, would have tried to fix this somehow. But 4 years in prison had taught me that sometimes the price of justice is higher than anyone wants to pay. So, what you're saying is, we're all dead because I wanted revenge. We're saying that maybe it's time to stop fighting each other and start fighting for survival, Sarah said. Because whether you like it or not, Halen, you're part of this family. And in Dmitri Kozlov's world, that makes you a target too. I sat back in my chair, looking at the documents spread across the coffee table, my carefully crafted demands that now seemed petty and pointless in the face of a much larger threat. "There's one more thing," Margaret said quietly. "Something we never told you because we thought it would be safer if you didn't know." "What now?" "The reason we chose you from the orphanage wasn't random. Your parents, your real parents, they worked for Dmitri Kozlov. They were killed when you were 6 because they tried to steal from him. We've been protecting you from him your entire life, just like we've been protecting Sarah." The room started spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my history, my connection to this family was crumbling around me. "That's impossible." "Your real name is Halen Petrov," Richard said. "Your father was Dimitri's accountant before he went into witness protection. When he and your mother were murdered, we pulled strings to make sure you disappeared into the foster system under a new identity. We adopted you not just to give you a good life, but to keep you alive." I stared at them, understanding, finally dawning. "So, when you sent me to prison—" "We were protecting both of our daughters the only way we knew how," Margaret finished. "We thought if you were in prison, you'd be safe from Dmitri. We thought if Sarah could take your place publicly, she'd be safe too. We never expected you to come back and expose everything." The bitter irony was perfect. I'd spent 4 years plotting revenge against the people who'd saved my life twice. Once from the orphanage, and once from a crime boss who wanted me dead. My quest for justice had just ensured that we were all going to pay the ultimate price. "So, what happens now?" I asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, it wasn't malicious or calculating. It was the smile of someone who'd finally found a worthy ally. "Now, we do what the Blackwood family has always done best," she said. "We survive, together." As I looked around the room at my fake family, who turned out to be my real family in all the ways that mattered, I realized that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's learning to become everything they never expected you to be. The girl who went to prison was looking for justice. The woman who came back had found something better. She'd found her true family, even if it might kill us all. And honestly, after everything we'd been through, that felt like exactly the ending we deserved.